But you know, we don't have 22 or 25 different versions of reality in which we live. We don't even have 4. We have one version of reality. That version of reality we perceive as nested systems. And the biophysical perspective is that in the biosphere, everything is contained within that. We have these nested systems. Now, these nested systems happen to be, like Gail was talking about this morning, emergent systems. They're self-organizing emergent systems, sometimes called complex adaptive systems. So my going-in assumption is that the same fundamental stochastic processes that shape our physical, chemical, and biological emergent systems also shape our social and economic emergent systems. Now, in my mind, I've been trying to figure out what these fundamental stochastic processes might be, and I can organize them into a block diagram like this that sort of tells the story for me. At the bottom we have, sorry?
What does emergent mean?
Emergent means you did not build it into the design. It organizes itself and comes out. The result is more than what you put into it. So at the bottom we have this fluctuation of recurring things, those things that happen relentlessly, one after another, over and over again, day after day after day, year after year after year, always repeating, but never exactly the same. It is in this background of relentless fluctuation that the components of complex systems appear accidentally, randomly, but most of the time they're not at all persistent. Then in that background of fluctuation, we have some things that even though everything else is changing relentlessly, they don't change. The total energy in a system is one of those things as an example. So these conservation effects provide a statistical platform on which more complex systems are able to organize themselves and emerge. So when these random accidental bits of complexity appear, some of them are selected for persistence. And the kinds of things that are involved in selecting them for persistence are like the maximum power principle, models of growth like EROI. And then we have, working against that at the same time, forces that cause complex systems to just fall apart. And there we've got thermodynamic entropy and stuff like that. Now I'm going to make what I know many of you are going to think is an outrageous claim. That's okay. I think economic agent-based models are the best type of economic model for studying issues of sustainability. Let me first describe what an agent-based model is. It's a computer-based economic model. When you construct it, you put independent agents inside the computer model interacting with one another. Now, the neat thing about an agent-based model is that it demonstrates a complex adaptive system. It demonstrates a self-organizing emergent system. It's not a simulation. It is a complex adaptive system. That's an important distinction. It's not a simulation. I'm not pretending that this is a self-organizing complex system. It actually is one. However, it's not predictive. You can't use an agent-based model to figure out what the cost of oil is going to be tomorrow, or what the weather is going to be tomorrow, or things like that. What it does do is it gives you an opportunity to induce understanding of the behavior of these kinds of systems. Now, when you're programming it, this is what makes it emergent. You program at the detailed level. You decide what are the basic rules for these agents when they interact with each other. Some of the rules might be biophysical, like where you get your food, how you reproduce, how and why you die. Some are economic, how you get into an economic transaction, buying and selling. Some are environmental, how you extract resources from the environment and how you dump your waste back into them. And once you've got a small set of rules, the best models have a really small set of rules, then the macroeconomic stuff just kind of flows out of it. Like bubbles rising to the top of a glass of beer, the macroeconomic statistics are at the top, employment statistics, GDP, prices, productivity, that kind of thing, if you've built the rules that are going to generate that kind of stuff. Very quickly, a capital exchange model is a particular kind of economic ABM, and this is where I think some of you in biophysical economics might have a little difficulty with this. It's the particular kind of agent-based model in which you just model the money, no mass, no energy, no goods, no services, no prices. It's, I know some of you are not going to like that. It's only the money, right? So you can have an agent-based model that is just about an ecosystem. You've got bugs in a pond and they don't use money. You can also have an agent-based model which is just in an economy where you look at the money and you don't worry about the energy. Some examples of this kind of model: Dr. Viktor Yakovenko's BDY model. Some of you may be familiar with that. He's shown them here and in various other places. And then my conservation of money laboratory that I'm going to show you briefly. It's basically Dr. Yakovenko's model with a little difference. In his model, he put a certain amount of money in at the beginning, and then the amount of money did not change. One of his models that he did not publish the details of, he had bankers in there. But most of the ones that he described in his publication did not have bankers. I wanted to understand how money behaves when a bank is involved, so I added bankers to his model, and that's what I have. Now, back to my outrageous claim. In 2005, a couple of researchers in Europe, at the time when interest in sustainable development was reaching a feverish pitch, these two researchers were concerned that with the great variety of economic models available, the advice coming to the policymakers, to the lawmakers, was often conflicted and not very appropriate to the issues peculiar to the question of sustainability. So they decided they were going to do a survey of all economic models available, and they were going to rank them according to criteria that were important to questions of sustainability, and they published their results in this paper. Now, this was done about 13 years ago. I really wish one would be redone again. It's beyond my ability to do it, but I think it's a great study. They published their results in 3 tables within this paper. For time's sake, I'm just going to go through one of those tables. I think the most important one. So the goal of their study was to figure out the best models to issue, to address issues of sustainability in policymaking. So the focus was advice for policymakers. These are 5 of the criteria that they used to evaluate the models. They lumped, I'm not sure how many, but it seems like there were about 30 models they looked at. They grouped them into 6 categories, and they evaluated one category against another. Agent-based models are within this category of what's called multi-agent models, and these are the scores that the agent-based models received. I'm going to compare those against the high scores of the other kinds of models. So for example, in interdisciplinary potential, if 2 experts from totally different disciplines collaborate on a model, are they both going to be happy? The system dynamics and multi-agents both receive top scores. In long-term intergenerational, do you deal with Inequities within a single generation, do you deal with inequities across generations? Again, system dynamics and multi-agents received top scores. When it came to uncertainty management, those kinds of models are specifically designed to deal with uncertainty, so it's no surprise that they came out with a top score. But agent...
Bayesian, I'm sorry.
Bayesian networks, did I not say that?
I didn't hear it.
Okay. The Bayesian networks, they came out with a 0.39, agent-based models a little bit behind with a 0.30. For local, global, is it the best advice for a village, for a province, for a country? Is it scalable in size? The agent-based models came out with a score of 0.34, double the score of the second place. And participation. Can you take it out of academia, show it to a man on the street who doesn't know economics, and involve him in the conversation so that you get some valuable feedback to improve the model? Agent-based models received a score of 0.40, twice the second place. Now, this is the most important of the three tables, but what really impressed me was that of the 19 criteria that these two researchers evaluated all of the models against, agent-based models came out as first place in 15 out of 19, and they came second place in the other 4. So at the time I read this, I had already been building agent-based models for about 20 years, and I was personally convinced that they were, well, first of all, really fun to make, but really instructive for me. So I was delighted to find this academic study that told me that I wasn't wrong in my opinions. But then you have to take it the next logical step. And I have to say, this is where I've been coming from for the past 8 years. If ABMs can demonstrate the fundamental stochastic processes that shape our one reality, why not use them as laboratory tools with which we can study those processes to get a deeper insight into the nature of economic sustainability? Okay, so now I get to my main title. What is the global financial economy? I'm going to call it the GFE because to say global financial economy takes time and my tongue gets tangled, and so I prefer to call it the GFE. When we think about a national economy, for a number of years now, we tend to talk about two things. We tend to talk about the real economy, you see that at the bottom, and then the financial economy. So the real economy, it's got the biosphere at the bottom, the atmosphere, the pedosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, all at the bottom. Energy comes in and flows through it, but mass doesn't come in and flow out. Mass circulates down in there. And then you've got this icing at the top of the cake, the fiat money. When we go to the financial economy, the real economy, the diagram at the bottom tends to describe an economy of the early 1800s, but since about the mid-1800s, we've had some financial innovations like fractional reserve banking and things like that. And we've got a new kind of economy that has emerged. We're still talking about a national economy. We tend to refer to that as the financial economy, but there's a third kind that in the past 50 years has appeared, and that's what I'm calling the GFE. You see, it's a nice blue color, the same as the blue color at the top of the financial economy. There's the various financial economies that exist around the world, and the blue at the top of them kind of merges nicely into the GFE. You can't really tell the difference, but there is a difference. It's my view, obviously I'm negative about this, the GFE is a parasitic system riding on top of the national financial economies. It emerged in the 1970s after a long period of gestation. It participates in those national economies, drawing positive credits from them and leaving negative debits behind. So that's why I think it's parasitic. Now, conservation laws, remember in my block diagram, conservation effects was the second box from the bottom. Conservation laws I would argue, form stable platforms on which fundamental stochastic processes can then do their magic. It's those conservation laws that allow the accidental production of fluctuations of complexity to actually be selected and preserved and then form slowly into the more complex aspects of the biosphere that we're all aware of. So way back when Adam was a boy, there were just biophysical laws, the laws of thermodynamics, conservation of mass and energy. But then along came civilization. About 5,000 years ago, we all had minds and we had thoughts and we agreed on some things. And these would start as small ideas that would spread and become the foundation for a more complex society to grow. So like the rungs of a ladder, getting ever more complex, civilization has climbed, it's fallen, tripped and fallen a number of times, but it's climbed up this ladder until here we are today. So for example, real estate laws back there, the ancient empires of China, of the Middle East, of the Mediterranean, of Mesoamerica, they were all based on owning and controlling land. A little bit later in China, fiat money was invented, and that concept, kind of a strange idea, has spread around the world until now fiat money is the only kind of money we have, really. Then there are a couple, there's reserve banking. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And these EFT protocols and HFT protocols, those are the final concepts that brought our modern GFE into existence. Now, at the bottom of that, I say these domains are stabilizing social means sufficiently well conserved. Well, what do I mean by sufficiently well conserved? I'm going to take a biological example, and I'm a Canadian. I'm going to take a Canadian example. Sufficiently well conserved so that it forms a stable platform for a complex society to build on top of that. So the biological example is DNA. Is DNA conserved? Well, no. Evolution has DNA changing all the time. Well, and certainly the amount of DNA is not conserved. It changes all the time. But we can do a calculation. The base rate, the number of base pairs in DNA transferred from one generation to the next. Now, a base pair is a unit from which the DNA molecule is built. So there are about 10 to the 9 base pairs in the human genome. But every time a new person is born, I didn't know the number was this big, about 80,000 of those base pairs are not properly copied. Now, I have every confidence that nature could arrange the reproduction of DNA to have perfect copies all the time. But when it comes to DNA in particular, you have to have reproduction with variation. So it's persistence requires that the copying of DNA not be perfect, that it have some error in it. So if you take the damage rate divided by the base rate and subtract it from 1, you can get something that I might call a conservation index for. Well, in Canada, every year banks release loans of about 10 to the 11th dollars, and now I don't know how you count something that you don't detect, but if you look up crime statistics, they say the number of dollars successfully counterfeited and slipped into the money supply in Canada each year, unnoticed, is about 60,000. Don't know where they get the number, but unnoticed counterfeiting, about 60,000. So you've got a damage rate, a base rate. We see that DNA is not well preserved because part of the evolution requires that it not be well preserved. But evolution of economic systems doesn't require that the variation come from preservation or poor preservation of money. So it's actually preserved to a fairly high level. But what's going on here? A whole bunch of people decided money is going to be treated with almost religious reverence, and therefore money will be conserved. Now, I'm going to get into that a little more. The GFE is a newly emergent ecosystem, not seen before in history. That's my argument. Now, if we look at the history of money, very quickly, started out with barter and debt. You might think of that as positive and negative money. Then it was replaced with commodity money. Then it was replaced with representative money. The Chinese invented fiat money about 1300. And that's pretty well the only kind of money we have at the moment, is fiat money. And eventually, representative money was brought to an end. A long, bumpy divorce proceeding with the gold standard finally came to an end in the early 1970s. The gold standard was abandoned. Something really important happened then. This strong link between money and gold was weakened. Not totally severed, but it was weakened, so that money was no longer tied to biophysical reality the way it had been before. But two other things happened at the same time. Yeah, and I was a programmer in the government when this happened, so I do recall this. Banks developed the Electronic Funds Transfer Protocols, EFT. That meant that they could move money from one bank account to another, or even from one bank to another, without moving any gold around, not even moving any paper around. They could just send a little biophysical signal along the wire. So there's still a tether to biophysical reality, but it's a very, very weak tether. And then in 1983, the NASDAQ decided to open itself for electronic trading, and now people could move stocks and bonds and ownership of things from one account to another without transmitting anything. You didn't have to move land to actually buy and sell land. Electronic trading was another weakening of that link. So with these kind of events 50 years ago, like a butterfly, modern money emerged from its long sleep in its cocoon and took flight. When that happened, it changed the world. I argue that modern money is just a little different from all money that existed prior to 1970. Now, it is conserved, and that has immense unintended consequences, and it's those unintended consequences that I wanted to explore when I built my model that is a variation of Dr. Yakovenko's model. So the dominant shape of money since the 1970s might be called C-shaped. That is, it's not made by the government, pushed down and pulled up again, U-shaped money. It's made by banks and merchants, loaned to peers in the economy, and then paid back to banks. Now, governments still have a role. They have a monopoly over creating the bills and coins, but those are just plastic bottles, right? It's not really money. A bank just, when it pulls a bill out of the drawer, it takes money out of your account, sticks it into the bill, you put it in your pocket. When you go to the bank, they put it in the drawer and they take the money out of that bill and they stick it in your account, right? So the bills and coins are fictitious and empty bottles, mason jars, that we use to carry money around with. So the structure of a modern national money supply might be considered to look like this. You've got the bills and coins that the government makes with its monopoly, but the real money supply is the bank loans, the positive money that the banks have and the negative money that they create. Now, when you go into a bank, how does a bank create money, or how does a merchant create money? It's the same in both cases, but let's say you go into a bank. You're a client of the bank, I'm a client of the bank, I have no money. And you're a banker, and you have no money. And I say, I'd like to borrow $1 million, please. And as a banker, you say, no problem. You fill out a loan agreement, you slide it up across the desk, and I sign it. I slide the $1 million loan agreement to you, and you put $1 million in my account. My net worth has not changed. Your net worth has not changed. You received $1 million and you paid $1 million. So the total money in the world has not changed. Now that's what I mean by conservation of money. Now, I could take that positive money and immediately pay off the loan and it's gone, right? But that's not what I do. I take that $1 million and I go out into the economy and I start spending it. And you as the banker, you say, well, I'm not going to sit here with this. I'm going to sell it on the debt market. So you sell the loan for some kind of a discount, and the negative money goes off in the market that way, and the positive money goes off in the market this way. And you expect that eventually that loan is going to be paid off, the money is going to trickle back, and it's gone, right? Well, mostly, right? There's always some that kind of wanders away over there and gets lost, and wanders away over there and gets lost. So, we have this axis of symmetry. So what we're conserving when we conserve money is the axis of symmetry. What kind of actions could break that symmetry? Well, the government could do things. It could print money, or it could tax money out of the population and then just destroy it. But economists and bankers don't like that. If you look up hyperinflation, you'll see that the Weimar Republic did that, and nobody says good things about them. And Venezuela seems to be in the same difficulty. I expect it has its similar roots. I can't create money. That's called counterfeiting, and I can't destroy money. That's called defacing the money of the realm. So we have these social beliefs, quasi-religious beliefs, that you just don't mess with money in these ways. Now, if that was only in Canada, you'd say, well, that's kind of an oddity, right? But those ideas have spread around the world, so that the entire world has this quasi-religious reverence for the conservation of money, so it is conserved all around the world. Now, my background training is in physics and mathematics, so I thought I could maybe put together a mathematical equation that you could call the conservation of money law. It's going to be different because money is not energy. It behaves a little differently. Well, in physics, you have two kinds of conservation laws. One is called the continuity equation, and the other one is for the whole system. So a continuity equation looks at a single transaction. If one molecule has energy and another molecule has energy, and they bump together, the amount of energy before they bump together is the same as the amount afterwards. So that's a continuity law. It's the same thing with money. If I buy a stick of gum and I give you 50 cents, it's 50 cents when I hand it to you, and it's 50 cents when you receive it, right? So in a single transaction, money is conserved. At the higher level, you can look at the entire money supply. Now, because I'm not sure whether the Canadian money supply is symmetric or asymmetric, because you know, I'm an old retired guy sitting in my basement Googling stuff, and there's only so much you can learn in that way. So I couldn't really find out what the Bank of Canada does, but I came up with a rule for all the different possibilities. Now, I mentioned this this model that is based on Dr. Viktor Yakovenko's model. I haven't said this in front of him, but I'm sure he wouldn't disagree. His model is a stupidly simple model. It is incredible how simple it is. But what is also incredible is how closely it mimics the behavior of reality. Because in his model, I should have put a copy of his diagram here, but in his model, you just put an amount of positive money into the model, and then it's conserved, and then they participate in transferring that money around the way it would in any economy, and you end up with a small number of people who are very wealthy, and a very large number of people who are very poor. So in that model, you demonstrate the bane of our reality, the bane of our existence for the past 5,500 years at least, where in every society, you've got a few people that control it all. So I thought I would take his stupidly simple model and just make one small change. I would put bankers in there, and they would create money the way bankers do in reality. And people would have to pay interest on the loans. And the money would go out into the economy and spread around. So banks in this model, after I got working at it for a while, I figured out banks really have two roles. They have a public service role, which is to defend the religious sanctity of money. It will be conserved in this sense that the amount of symmetry in the system will be conserved. So I put a fractional reserve banking system in there so the money supply would breathe in and out. I made sure that every transaction had double entry bookkeeping so there are no arithmetic errors. Well, I didn't emulate counterfeiting, but that would be the role of banks to prevent counterfeiting. And then they have their own private role, which is to make a profit. So when I start my model up, I start with a slightly asymmetric money supply. I give the bankers no money, but I give all the people $3,000. So that they've got an initial endowment, an initial allotment given to them by the government. After 2,000 ticks, the bankers are still poor, but the size of the money supply has expanded. Some people are very wealthy, some people are poor. By 10,000 ticks, the bankers are getting more wealthy. By 30,000 ticks, the bankers are quite wealthy. And by 60,000 ticks, the bankers have it all. I'm thinking, so the positive money wanders off, and the negative money wanders off, and it didn't come together again, right? There was no, it's gone. Is that happening in the real world? Well, I kind of knew it was, so it was no big surprise, but I wanted to just make sure that my model is at least consistent with reality. This doesn't prove that the model is right. It just shows that it's consistent. And global financial assets, growing nicely, growing steadily. The total amount of money in the world exceeds the amount of property that you could actually hold, I think, at this point. I'm happy to say that as a retired high school teacher of Ontario, my Ontario teacher's pension plan is in there somewhere, so I own a piece of that. And unfortunately, I own a piece of that too. I own $50,000 of that for Canada's share of sovereign debt. So the positive money has gone to pension plans, corporate war chests, large pools of positive money that are used to control the world. And what's been left behind in the national coffers is the large pool of debt that keeps getting bigger and bigger. Now, energy and money are linked. How much time do I have left? Energy and money are linked in the real economies, but they behave differently. And because they behave differently, that link is stretched, maybe even broken. I think stretched is really the proper word. So what is the money-energy linkage? Energy fluxes are the heart of the real economy. Money is a lien on energy consumption. I absolutely agree with that in the real economy. Energy is always positive. Energy is conserved. Energy degrades and dissipates. So I think from a biophysical economics point of view, most people would agree with that. In the GFE, it's similar but not the same. Modern money fluxes are the heart of the GFE. Energy costs change so slowly as to be effectively constant. So it's a small, predictable cost of little consequence in the GFE. And I'll get to the reason why that is so. Modern money is created in positive and negative forms, so that's a little different from energy. Money is conserved, that's the same as energy, but it does not degrade or dissipate. It's kind of persistent. Once it separates, like I am not going to use my pension plan to pay off Canada's share of the sovereign debt. That's never going to happen. That positive money and that negative money is not going to come together and go, it is not going to happen. So money is peculiarly persistent once it has gotten into those distant pools. Now I want to talk about high frequency trading. This emerged in the 1930s, and has now become what I would consider to be almost something of plague proportions. How does it work? Well, all the investors in the world you could put on a continuum. You've got the buy and hold people like Warren Buffett over here. He looks at a firm, he looks at the corporate culture, he looks at the product mix, decides that's where I want to put my money, and he stands back for 8 years as a shareholder and lets the profits roll in. At the other end, you've got the high frequency traders. They don't want to hold anything for more than a day. They don't want to hold it overnight. So they watch the price of the stock for a period of time until they develop a kind of a profile. Now they use something, extreme value theory, the same kind of mathematics that you use to predict earthquakes or rogue waves or something like that. Once they've got a profile, they set a trigger. If it goes below that 25% line, the probability that it's going to go up is really high, so they're going to buy in at that point. Now, I'm going to skip over that slide. I was thinking, why don't people just jump in and do it all? You know, why isn't this the only kind of trading that goes on? You'd have to earn huge amounts of money. Now, the slide I just skipped over for the sake of time, I did a little EROI calculation on the returns. And the returns in 1930 were really big, and the returns nowadays would be tremendous. And I was wondering, why aren't they so tremendous? Then I found this slide, and I was confused at first. I thought, what is happening here? Well, after I looked at it for a while, I thought, this looks just like an invasive species. It starts, you've got exponential growth, and at that point, during exponential growth, it's doing battle with the organisms in the ecosystem that it's more able to survive when it's doing battle with those. But eventually it hits some kind of carrying capacity and the growth stops. After that, it's not doing battle with the pre-existing organisms in the ecosystem, it's doing battle with itself. So at this point, you've got high-frequency traders fighting with high-frequency traders. The peculiarity of that is, instead of having immense profits, it's a 50-50 flip of the coin who wins, right? If you've got two high-speed traders fighting with, duking it out with each other, so you hit some kind of a carrying capacity. Now I thought invasive species was kind of a derogatory thing to call it, so I thought I'd come up with another description like sustainable parasite load. So how is the GFE different from a real economy? I want you to look at the third box down in particular. In the 1960s, the average investment in the New York Stock Exchange was held for 8 years. So everybody was a Warren Buffett thing, right? In 2017, on the New York Stock Exchange, the average investment was held for 20 seconds. 20 seconds. The average time that it took to do a transaction on the New York Stock Exchange in 2017 was 1/1,000,000th of a second. The difference between the winner and the loser was 1/1,000,000th of a second. They developed algorithms that would watch the prices go by, create the profile, set the trigger, jump in and buy, then jump out and sell, right? So it was algorithms doing battle with algorithms. I'm going to round it out now. There's a great story for January of this year. One high-frequency trader made a little tweak to his algorithm, thinking that he would just be a little faster than the other guys, and accidentally purchased several billions of dollars worth of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange that he didn't want to purchase. So he had to sell them in a hurry. Lost $400 million. Well, very quickly, the other high-frequency traders learned about this, like sharks circling an injured animal, and within a few days, the injured HFT trader was swallowed up in a merger. think we'll stop there.
We have time for a few questions. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to
Get started because we're on a schedule. I'm going to cue you in as to what we're doing here. We have, as we should, exactly 40 minutes for Dunstan, a 30-minute presentation, 10 minutes for questions, and at 6, Solus is Skyping in, and perhaps we'll have a minute, maybe not, to get some coffee in between. I don't think so. So just keep that in mind. With that, we switch our attention to agricultural systems, and we introduce Dunstan, and he has going to present the impact of agricultural production systems on the energy efficiency of agro-bioenergy systems. Dunstan, you got it.
Good afternoon. I'll be talking on the impact of agricultural production
Louder.
systems. Okay. I'll be talking on the impact of agricultural production systems on the energy efficiency of agro-bioenergy systems. Agro-bioenergy systems are biofuel production systems. And the energy efficiency.
Do we have the microphone? Do you have the microphone?
Sorry. Yes, we do.
Hold on. This one works. Is there something up there? What's that? Oh, okay. Sorry.
This is
Thanks out.
So agro-bioenergy systems are biofuel systems, and the metric for the energy efficiency is net energy gain and energy return on energy investment. Agricultural biomass became an important source of energy approximately within the last 20 years, and this is as a result of massive depletion of fossil fuel resources and the need for climate change adaptation. However, at some point, researchers realized that it's a bubble that might soon burst because of indirect energy from input production that is usually not factored into some of the research that actually say that it's a good thing to go into biofuels. And looking back, most of the previous sustainability assessments is either talking about which feedstocks are good, which technologies are the best, what's the profitability, what's their contribution to gross domestic product, or what are the effects of subsidizing biofuels against other energy sources in the energy industry, or it's the possibility of affecting food security, and also the displacement of land as a result of acquisition of land for large-scale production. Also, land cover change and biodiversity issues are also being discussed. And usually some of them also focus on how much of useful energy is being delivered to the society at the end of the day. But equally important that usually do not take the center stage is the impacts of agronomic factor options and agricultural production systems. So this study is basically focused on the effects of these agronomic factor options and agricultural production systems. And like I said previously, the metrics being used to measure that is the net energy gain and the energy return on energy invested. And the case study systems, biofuel systems we are looking at is maize, ethanol, and maize biogas production systems across generic global agroclimatic zone scales, which is tropics, subtropics, and temperate regions. Looking at farm power, the alternative farm powers considered under the studies include different implementations of tractors, use of different types of animal labor, human beings, for fertilizers, animal manure, and biogas digestate, for seed sowing options, GMO seeds and hybrid, and for tillage, both conventional, reduced, and no-tillage options, as well as the different kinds of irrigation options we can find. Agricultural production systems, basically the two that are usually mentioned is a industrialized type of agricultural production systems whose motive is usually maximization of profit, and the eco-agricultural systems which still tries to factor in the maintenance of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The two types of systems have their different slants and emphasis, and the industrialized systems are more on the large scale, and the eco-agricultural systems, which are mostly still found in the developing countries, are usually on a fewer acreage. The method adopted for this study is the LCA substitution approach. With regards to the different agronomic factor options we used, we selected some of the factors as baseline and looked at the individual effects of the other factors within the different agronomic factor categories. For the agricultural production systems, building up to the final net energy and EROI values, we summed up values for industrialized agriculture, for the higher HP tractor implementations, synthetic fertilizers, conventional tillage, and sprinkler and drip irrigation for the industrialized systems. And for the agroecological systems, we we considered human and animal labor, as well as smaller tractor implementations. Fertilizer options from waste sources like animal manure and biogas digesters, and reduced and no tillage, as well as rain-fed and surface irrigation. Some of the general assumptions we made, we used a range of values of conversion factors from previous energy and ROI studies for the production and use of fossil fuel fertilizers and pesticides, as well as for the different farm operations. We, however, excluded tractors, mounted implements, and irrigation platforms because we consider them not to be within other boundaries of LCE other than this. Well, we had problem with data, with detailed data, so we had to make assumptions with regards to the smaller implementations of tractors. We assumed that the energy for consumption for plowing for most of the other operations. And for animal and biogas digested, we assumed that the energy for fertilizer production is saved for animal manure, and the energy for fertilizer and lime production is saved for biogas digested. Also for the GMOs, we also did not find data on the energy for production, so we assumed that such could be in between energy for production of hybrid and native seeds. For rain-fed irrigation, we assume no fossil energy consumption for irrigation, and we only consider the annual operation energy for all the artificial irrigation systems. Well, some of the yields, the maximum attainable yields data was also not very consistent, but we try to manage with what we have for the different agronomic, for the different agroclimatic zones. For the co-products, we assume that energy for some of the co-products are being returned to the field for other farm operations. Well, the result was we have quite a range for both the energy and EROI, some from neutral to positive and negative, some from positive to negative. But the best performance for the farm power category was the 10 to HP single axle tractors, riding types, being most of which are being made in India and China, and also for horses and humans. for the seed sowing options, the native seeds were the better performance. For fertilizer, animal manure, and biogas digestate for tillage, conventional tillage without pesticide, and the reduced and low tillage. And for irrigation options, the rainfed and the surface. Looking at how much within the different the different agronomic factor options added, changing fertilizer options seem to add the most to the energy efficiencies, followed by farm power, and then irrigation options. The values of energy we got for maize ethanol was adding up the different agronomic factors adopted within the different agricultural production systems, showed that we had as much as ×4 of the energies for ethanol production, and as much as ×2 for the biogas production systems. For the ERI, we have as much as ×3, and for maize ethanol, and around ×2 for the maize biogas system. So adopting eco-agricultural systems may not provide the kind of profit, financial profit that investors look forward to, but it's still conservative enough to help maintain the biodiversity and ecosystem services we have, even though the yields might be lower. While this may not be attractive for developed economies, it's a good strategy that can contribute to the concept of food independence and energy sovereignty, or integrated rural development for developed countries. And it could also contribute to the realization of a circular economy, because co-product reuse might play an important role in the eco-agricultural production systems. The results were comparable to previous results on the ERI of biofuels, even though better estimates can be obtained at local and regional levels. And then we still need better database to conduct a spatio-temporal assessment of what is being found at the moment, but this we don't have at the moment because there are no continuous data. It may also be helpful in the long run to look at what other indicators of other sustainability indicators looks like, considering these economic factors and the different agricultural production systems. One important thing I forgot on the last slide was the fact that even though it's on a small scale, it's possible to achieve more under the eco-agricultural systems if farmers could constitute themselves in networks and cooperatives and work towards galvanizing such production of energy, which will enhance the agriculture at rural level and also gives room for some medium to small scale production.
Okay. Questions? Go ahead.
Okay, so you've illustrated that
over to you. I think we're all set. I'll let you know when we're at the 20-minute mark.
Right. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. Good morning from New Zealand. It's 10 a.m. local time here in the middle of winter and pretty cold. And the first thing I want to say before I say anything more is it's an absolute honour and a privilege to be presenting to you folk who I've read so much about through your papers and books and so forth, and it's been a long journey, but I'm gradually making my way closer over into this area of work while trying to maintain my professional credibility as I do so. So it's a real honour to be presenting to you this evening, dear, and I think I have an interesting story for you. I'd imagine it's been a pretty long day, 6 o'clock there, so we won't muck about. So I'll talk a little bit about agriculture in New Zealand and how I see it fitting into how biophysical economics works into that. It's not going to be a data-intensive kind of a presentation, but it's really taking a bigger look at the overall picture and how we can build biophysical economics more into our social thinking and the systems that we are going to use to head forward towards 2050. This is the reason I'm not with you in person. Several months ago, when I first got this scholarship, I discussed with my wife Emily about, there's the Biophysical Economics Conference is coming up in June in the US, and the due date for our baby, our first child, was July 7th. And she said, there's no way that you're going over that, you need to be home, and just in case the baby decides to come early. Well, guess what happened exactly 24 hours ago to the minute. Wow. So that's Olive, and she's all in one piece. It was a little bit of an epic, it was a 3-day epic journey, but she's all here, and I'm not going to miss the next Biophysical Economics Conference for love nor money, so I'll see you next time for sure. My chairman has always told me that people deal with people, so I had to slip a slide in here out that just shows my visit to the US several years back now, where I stayed with Charlie and Myrna. Absolutely top hosts, and I've told so many people about the discussions that we had. We would just sit for hours and talk until my head couldn't possibly fit anything more inside it, and then I would go for a walk and come back and we would do it all over again. And it was transformational, Charlie. What we talked about there, it set some stuff in motion. That's why I'm here now, and that's why I see the application of these methods more widely in society just as so critical. It's just, it could not be more important. Had a fantastic time with Dave Murphy. We had a beer at the oldest pub in New York, so that's stuck in the memory banks too. And several years before that, I went to Boulder, Colorado, so that's Al Bartlett in the bottom left of your screen there, and I spoke with him. He's passed on now, but his ideas and his the essential exponential and the work that he did with the ridiculousness of this endless exponential population growth, that was transformational too. Once I heard him talk about that, I just couldn't think of a career that didn't integrate that kind of stuff somehow. And so the bottom right picture is what I do in a bit of my spare time. That's in Otago, that's my local region, and I do some contract hunting work for our Department of Conservation. I run a industry-funded program for the New Zealand farmed deer industry, so we have around 1 million deer on about 2,000 farms throughout the country, and I run a program that draws information from a national slaughterhouse surveillance database and analyses that for industry trends. and for individual farm productivity and health information. And we work with veterinarians and all aspects of the industry to promote healthier deer and optimise productivity. I'm very careful not to say to maximise productivity these days. It's one of these little steps towards getting people's heads around the idea that bigger is not always better. So putting that aside, about 8 months ago I received a Nuffield Agricultural Scholarship. So this is an international body that was established in 1947, and it takes people in the rural sector who are interested in developing their thinking and their leadership skills and bringing them together from all over the world for an intensive period of presentations and discussions, and then you disband into smaller groups and travel for 2 months, a super intensive travel schedule where you speak with farmers and food production specialists all throughout the world. So through March and April, this is what I've been doing. So we went to, where are we here? We just fish down through here. Righto, we might skip on to the next slide here. One of the things that you take personally to that meeting and those travels is your own topic that you want to develop further. And so my one is optimising primary food production systems in New Zealand, but also the methodology will need to be applied elsewhere in the future. Well, it needs to be applied now. Under energy constraints, and those constraints may either be regulatory for greenhouse gas emissions or through physical limitations in our available resources. And I see the idea of biophysical economics is the perfect vehicle for investigating that, and it builds on some previous work that I did through the agricultural research group on sustainability. So this is almost 8 years ago now. So this works with several universities within New Zealand and some agribusiness groups, and we looked at a little over 100 farms over 5 or 6 years. I think we collected a huge amount of data, and I did a fairly rough and ready energy return on investment for these farm systems. So there's 3 systems: the sheep and beef approach, kiwi fruit orcharding, and dairy farming. And within each of those systems there was the organic approach to production, and there was also the conventional approach to production. But I'm not going to go into that. I'm here to talk about what we did with the Nuffield travel. So we stayed in the Netherlands for the first around 10 days. We had presentations from top-level people from agricultural banks such as Rabobank, soil scientists, food experts, farming experts, the whole gamut. It was just, it was absolutely incredible. And there was around 150 of us, and we would then, at the end of the day, we would go away with and do and talk the whole night through of the world's issues that we're facing in terms of food production over the coming 20 or 30 years. The key things that came out of these discussions I've listed here. One of the top ones was the price of land, and how there's a growing disconnection between the high price of it and the income that can be returned through growing food off it. We saw this repeated through all of the countries that we visited, well, most all of the countries, perhaps with the exception of the Ukraine. The quality and availability of good labour to maintain the farming systems was also an issue everywhere. We talked a lot about the physical potential remaining in food production. There are definitely countries underdeveloped, and I'm going to be a little bit crass in my use of underdeveloped and developing in low tech and high tech, but my theme is to get across to you the spectrum here. I'm not in pursuit of political correctness here. I just want to get across to you the idea of these spectrums and the huge impact that these can have on the potential of the food production in those areas. And a great example of that would be people's perceptions of Africa, where they are just so divergent that you would hardly believe it. We had the Iberian from Rabobank telling us that Africa was going to be one of the biggest challenges over the next 20 years as the population there continued to increase, but the food production did not keep in step with that. And so he foresaw this as an enormous challenge. At the same time, we had some guests from Kenya there, and they were saying it's actually the other way around. They have, Kenya at least, and a lot of the other African countries, have a very young population, cell phone, and they want to produce as much food as they can for not just them but the rest of the world. So the divergence in those views was, it was a little bit sobering actually, because what you were really left thinking was all these experts, so-called experts in food and farming from all around the world, when you get them together in one room, nobody knows what's going on really at the end of the day. Population growth, well, I'm preaching to the converted there, so I won't tell you much about that, but just keep it, it's on their radar, it definitely is. And the climate change, all of the farmers we talk to, probably 80% of them mentioned specifically changes that they had seen in the last 5 to 10 years in their local environment that was disrupting, shall we say, if you want to use another buzzword, their established systems that have been in place for a long time were no longer working as well, because strange things were happening, and they might have been extra in one farming system and less rainfall in another, or just a 2-week change in a particular window for some kind of operation, but they were noticing changes that were putting stress on their systems. Another of the key things was the divergence between the food consumer and the producer. The people living, a lot of the people living in the cities these days are so disconnected from their food that they've lost touch with the actual cost of it, let alone the true cost of it if you built into it the environmental aspects. And the producers are perceived as, I think evil is too strong a word, but their integrity is not considered to be high by the consumer, which is something that we really need to change around. And I think providing very cheap food is not actually helping us in that regard. We spoke a little about the rise of global nationalism, and I spoke very briefly about it too with Jessica when we were setting this presentation up. And it's unnerving, but there's not an awful lot we can do about that, I don't think. But it was on the radar. And I think one of the last main things that came out was that, I mean, we don't really have a food shortage problem, that's for sure. There's more people overweight in the world than there are hungry. It's a food distribution problem that we have, and a quality of food problem. And I think the last theme that we talked about in this 10 days was the race to the bottom, which is a curious kind of thing, and it's where farmers seem to think that the more they intensify and the more that they increase their production, the lower. It doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective, at least. You want to get a good price for your food, but it's a pervasive idea that it goes all around the world, and I'm not sure quite how you would turn that around. But so that's a snatch of probably the key points that came out of 2 weeks of some very intense sit-down discussions with 150 people from everywhere from Japan to Uruguay to the US to England to New Zealand to Australia, everywhere in between. It was a fantastic event. So from there we moved on to our international travel, and one of the things that came out, I'm going to take you for a little slideshow now of the travels, and they're ordered from the lower production systems that we visited to the higher production systems. And one of the things that we covered early on with that is the use of power, use of hunger as a power tool. And so we spoke with, so we were in the Netherlands for our conference, and we talked a lot about the hunger winter in 1944 to 45, and the political causes and the environmental causes and the logistical causes. But the one thing that we came away with was the importance of providing adequate food for people, and how when you get a break in that system, if that food is not there, all of the other established systems in society that hang off it, they don't last very long at all. Oh, that's good. I can see the screen that you're looking at in the corner of my screen here, so I can see when our next slide comes through. So we went through. So this is here. This is starting off in the low-tech type system. So that's a herd of 200 cows that were all milked by hand in the field, and they were called by name. There was a team of about 8 different people who milked them, and they called each individual cow by name, by hand. Simply incredible. But they're still breeding top-level animals, like you can see in the bottom right there. And that's just simply a little bit of scenery down the bottom. I imagine some of you would have been to Kenya. It was absolutely spectacular. It was my first time there. But so this was an example of the low-tech systems. And coming to your next slide, we also went to the Ukraine, which has some incredible soil, the Chernosem soil, which is great, deep, black resource, high organic content, beautiful contour. You can grow anything you like there, provided you can get the water to it. That's the upshot to it. The challenge, it's the low level of development for the majority of the country, which you can see there, and some of the rest of the images. So a lot of it is subsistence, or it's organised in a way that all of the locals have a 2 or 3 hectare block out in those great vast open paddocks where they grow their food for the summer and their winter resources. But the low level of development was a real contrast to the huge amount of potential that they have sitting in their landscapes. The collapse of socialism has left a cultural scar there, which is very slow to heal, and it leaves some thought process, and very, very, very challenging to turn around and to convince these people of the benefits that can be had by grouping together and getting more modern equipment and building up their food production systems to improve their life. It's an incredible thing to see. The next slide's coming through here. Some of them are fairly heavy files, a lot of pictures there. So we also went to Soweto near Johannesburg and looked at some small plot food production systems there. The hardship there, I'm loath to use the word poverty, but the challenges that those people go through is, it was a good education for someone who lives in a very privileged environment to go and experience a little of what they produce their food, the systems they produce their food in. It was an excellent education for me. But just low tech, super low tech, and even finding labour. The the level of education and social drive is not there to inspire people to get together and grow food for themselves, and they struggle for that. So next slide's coming through here. We did a visit to a farm group. This was also near Kenya. There were 30 or 40 different farmers who would group together and start to talk about ways that they could improve their systems. But still, the level of education, there's very little access to capital, and simply the logistics of making those changes is just is an enormous mountain to try and get over. We had a semi-formal meeting with some of these farmers. You can see us all with our nuffield coats on there, and we spoke with these guys for an afternoon where at first we talked a little bit about the systems that we were familiar with, but that really, you can see in the bottom images there, the farmers were far more interested in actually having a look at our farms in our own countries and looking at the cows that some of our other team members were milking. You can see in the bottom left there, by the time we left, they all wanted to come along with us and have a look at the systems that we were using. It was fantastic. Next slide's coming now with some of the medium tech systems. I can see we're already running through on time. There's a lot of pictures here, we'll just give it a tick. We might even skip over a couple here. So we looked at medium tech systems, some in the US, just small scale type farmers who were providing beef to the local market, the wheat marketing in the US wheat system is, I'd still class it as medium tech. And then we went through to some of the higher tech systems. It's getting stuck on that. There must be a new one. There we go. No, come on. That's the one. So these are some of the larger scale US dairy systems, which were incredible to see. The organisation in it, providing the inputs and then dealing with the outputs of these systems from an energy return on investment perspective were just fascinating, and we would come away thinking at the end. I think all of us. So there was an Irish dairy farmer, there was a Canadian mixed farmer, and several Australians on mostly large scale farms, and a Scottish woman who was involved with slug research in amongst my group, and a couple of us Kiwis, and we could all, even though none of the rest of my group had an appreciation excuse me, of biophysical economics, they just had an underlying gut feeling that the long-term intensification of these processes was not really sustainable.
You're at the 20-minute mark, so.
Yeah, good, thank you. Right, I'll show you two more. Yeah, good. So we did a little bit of look at the future tech of agriculture too. This is Michael Horsch. So he's in the Czech Republic, and he can see automated farming systems as clearly as you and I can see from one side of the street to the other. And he sees them becoming commonplace within 10 years or 20 years. It was amazing to see these future-thinking people, African friends, and where they see food production going. It was just incredible. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of the spectrum of what we saw over 2 months of travel. So each day we would see 2 or 3 different farm groups and it was intensive, but it was absolutely incredible. So we did come back with a few things to think about. I'll just wait for this next slide to load up, hopefully. No, we won't actually. We'll skip along. So one of the main things that I came home thinking about was this spectrum of development from systems like largely subsistence type systems that have very low production, no regulatory systems. So there's no in the external systems that are related to the food. It's just simply about growing enough for your family. And then you can see this, there's a spectrum there that you go through as production increases, but then all of the associated systems need to intensify as well around that, and trying to think through an optimised operating space there. Bring that home to my own personal study and looking at New Zealand farming systems. But I started to think twice about it, and I won't dwell on these slides in the interest of time, and I'd imagine you'll be looking forward to your dinner. I'll skip through, and I see the email there, so I'll post these to Jessica, and you're more than welcome to look through and send any questions you might have. I would be delighted to talk more on the topic. So really what we looked at, the vast majority of it was simply behind the farm gate. And you need to expand your mind to think, well, there's all of the processing, the distribution systems, and at the end of the day, it all needs to be tied back to some value for that product as well. So there's whole dimensions there that we didn't really get to discuss. The environment was an incredible thing to come out. The farmers talking about climate change, and also we spent some time around Cape Town there. We passed by some of that's a dam that you're looking at there. That's one of the dams that supplies water to Cape Town, and it's just bone dry. We spent some time in Oregon, out on the coast, talking with the oyster industry about the impact of ocean acidification on their industry, but also on the salmon industry. The incredible thing was they didn't actually seem too worried about what was happening. They seemed to think that they could deal with it easily enough, and I'm not sure that I shared that view. The culture of the people was another thing that I really took home. It just thought about for ages and ages. The history and the experiences of those cultures that go into the psyche of the people and the opportunities that brings, but also the challenges. We talk a lot about the land ownership and reform in Africa, and I just cannot see how that is going to improve our food production systems. There's a seething mass of challenge in there in any kind of reform that they try to implement. And yes, it's true, there's an enormous potential there to increase the food that might come out of a system like that, but I would warn against underestimating the challenges of the social and the psychological landscapes of what you're trying to work with there. There's an interesting, we had some interesting discussions over a few glasses of vodka in the Ukraine about the balance between corruption and entrepreneurial practice. And I'm not sure that we really got to the finer point of what the answer was, but there is a very thin line there that we, so much of that is a social perspective as well. It was just incredible. But I will trot along. So where I came to, so okay, I came back and I thought about, right, how am I going to apply this to New Zealand farming systems? And immediately I realised that, well, getting any serious data for energy return on investment comparisons and how these systems could be optimised is going to be fairly hard. I also recognise that, broadly speaking, not just here but in other countries as well, we can make some fairly accurate predictions about changes that needs to happen, and in accordance with biophysical economic thinking and genuine sustainability. And meat, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this debate for alternative proteins, and dairy products are in a similar kind of a boat. We simply cannot continue to consume and produce the amount of these products that we do. They're too hard on the environment. I've got a little line there. In New Zealand, we're in a terrible spot in that situation. The exports of our milk powder, which is one of the exports that our economics really swings off, it's gone up fourfold in the last 20 years. So we're exporting over 1 million metric tons of this stuff. It's a low value product. We collect it all from the farms, and we have armies of trucks that would beg a belief. And then we use coal and gas to cook all of the water out of it. And then we put it on a ship and we send it to the other side of the world and we sell it for peanuts. And the water that it consumes is a topic of very intense debate at the moment. You'll watch this space, there'll be change coming here. There has to be change. So I thought, well, if we can't get the data to do these careful analyses, maybe we need another foot in the door. I'm going over time here, so I'll skip quickly. Now that foot in the door remarkably showed up earlier this year with New Zealand's ambition to create a zero carbon act. So the intention is to have us carbon neutral, or at least a lower. So at the moment we currently we're currently producing around 80 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and they want to reduce that to almost 1/4 of that amount by 2050. Even though we've increased by 20% since 1990, so you get an idea of the trend of increase over that time. So I need to, at this point I got a little bit stuck and I just backpedaled a little bit, and I thought, if we could get some way of building biophysical economics into this journey to a zero carbon economy, maybe that would be the vehicle that we can help people get their heads around the challenges that they face in this golden unicorn of a low carbon or a zero carbon economy. They're not digesting at least energetic implications of that, let alone some of the other implications. And I see biophysical economics as an ideal way for getting those considerations across. This is a slide, so from the government's draft document on creating the pathway to this low carbon economy. So you see there's the laws in the government and this independent climate body that they're going to establish to help inform both of these other key aspects that are going to go into a society that is a low emissions version of what we have today. Certainly I see biophysical economics as fitting in as a component of that independent climate body, but we need to bring with that an integrity for that group, and there's definitely some expertise here in New Zealand, and I think we need to connect it up more closely with the international society. And one of the examples of that group is the Wise Response Group, which I've just come across recently in part of these scholarship adventures and looking more into the existing networks. There are networks here in New Zealand that we can link more closely in with biophysical economics. They're thinking along the same lines, but we just need to bring a little bit more cohesion to it and link up to make a cool international community that we can then put to work in creating the laws and the government systems that are going to drive this change. So my intention is part of this scholarship now is coming more away from the numbers side of things and more towards getting a community of people together that can inform this independent climate body and really start to get the discussion going on where we need to go. And I think if we can't do it here in New Zealand where we have so many keen farmers and a fairly reasonable level of regulatory control, as well as our natural endowments with water and land, I'm not sure how other countries will be able to achieve it. And I see us as being able to provide a template that we can then help other countries do a similar thing. And of course, I'm preaching to the converted again here, but you'll see at the bottom there, the only slight hiccup with this transition to our low carbon economy, whether it's for farmers or for society in general, is that success to a lot of people is going to look like a lower quality of life than what they enjoy already. But I don't see us really as having a lot of other options, and I'd be delighted to talk any of those possible options over with you folk when we get a chance. So this is my dear friend Josh. He was on the travels with us, looking up at this lake that used to feed water to Cape Town, and I'll leave you with that as something to think about. And I would like to extend the offer of linking up with us here in New Zealand. We would be delighted to join your group and to integrate and interact more effectively than what we have done in the past. And also I would love to invite you all here to a conference, perhaps not the next one that you have, but one or two down the track. It would be fantastic to get you all over as a group, and I would imagine it will be a far larger group by that point to talk about these things in New Zealand. So that's the length and breadth of my presentation. I thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your conference.
Thank you for that, Solace. We hadn't contemplated how we're going to do questions here. I'm not sure if you can hear from the audience, or we'll bring folks up here to the podium when they ask. So
And through a series of fortuitous events, I ended up being a fish guy going to ESF. And there I was very fortunate not only to meet Jerry Mead, but to receive a fantastic education, in no small part due to Charlie and a few other professors. And certainly one of many things that always stuck with me is, maybe to paraphrase, the only thing worse than running out of cheap oil is not running out of cheap oil. And back in grad school, I sort of thought we had a lot more time to deal with climate change, and I was probably more worried about peak oil, and maybe it's switched now. And given climate change, I'm almost hoping that we run out of oil pretty soon. But anyway, so I don't think I have to describe my mental model of the future. We probably all share something similar. And my students always ask, well, what should I be doing? And I really want to turn the question around on them to say, I don't know, what should I be doing? Why don't you tell me? So I've thought long and hard about this, and it's kept me up many, many nights. Maybe the most important thing that I can do, and maybe all of us in the position to do, could be to teach biophysical economics. So after a very long process of teaching several short courses and special courses, finally getting a proposal through, now this course is part of the official wildlife curriculum, and students can take this, our students can take this, as an economics course. And the demand's so high, now I have to offer it I want to offer it every semester instead of only every year. I'm trying to retool my research program and propose some fisheries research that's going to be more relevant in an age of scarcity and economic constraints. In my one and only term as a faculty senate member, I introduced a resolution to ask the university system to divest from fossil fuels, and several years later, under intense pressure from especially the Maine Students for Climate Justice, University of Maine became the first public university to divest from coal, so most of the way there. And as the director for the Maine chapter of the Study Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, I give talks like this that are usually very well received by the students and maybe not so much by the administrators. And in my private life, I've taken on a lot more activism than I ever thought I would before, and I found fantastic allies in the Penobscot Indian Nation. But personally, what should I do? So my long-term plan is to buffer myself and my family the best as I can from industrial civilization, tumbling down the backside of Hubbard Curve or falling off Seneca Cliff, whatever metaphor you think is appropriate. And essentially, this is what Nancy Lee Woods was talking about yesterday, dealing with these four interrelated realities. And so my plans and the subject of this talk are to localize production of food and fuel and commodities and whatever else is possible to increase my family's self-reliance, invest in productive capital and appropriate technology, and also useful skills for a future of constraints imposed by energy, climate, debt, reduce dependence as much as possible or practical on fossil fuels and complex technology, minimize entanglements with the financial system, which is very difficult. Talk to my TIA CREF advisor about that. And build a pocket of resilience. I don't expect that these are solutions, but I think that they're moderately intelligent responses. I don't have any illusions about achieving sustainability, whatever that means, or self-sufficiency. This isn't quite a bullets, beans, band-aids, and bunker mentality. Maybe it's halfway there. But through another series of fortuitous events and also some careful planning, I ended up in Maine, actually with my dream job that I had hoped for when I got out of college. And I've been trying to do this homesteading for about the last 12 years. And I've been collecting data on it. That's what I'm going to show you today. And it's at a very preliminary stage, very coarse analysis, and I'm really looking forward to whatever criticisms and comments that you have. So why Maine? Probably not a surprise. Maine has an awful lot of lakes, ponds, streams, intact forests for the most part. It's, I think, the most heavily forested state, and that provides a very strong ability to produce clean water. And Charlie, I'm sure, can attest to this. that Maine still has a lot of native fisheries. Many of them are somewhat intact, and actually tremendous restoration potential. I've been involved with some dam removal projects in the Penobscot River, opening up thousands of kilometers of original or historic habitat to sea-run fish. Maine is the last stronghold for native brook trout. Atlantic salmon, wild sea-run salmon are holding on by their fins. Landlocked salmon are pretty abundant. Maine has a temperate climate and cold, snowy winters, at least for the time being. Relatively low population density, and a very close proximity to Canada. And there's actually quite a bit of talk in Maine, especially rural Maine, about potentially joining Canada someday if the geopolitical situation changes.
Is that your governor who's leading this?
He's on his way out, and I'm not going to talk about him, but I look forward to a new administration. And thankfully, I have a very secure, at least for the time being, tenured, well-paying job at the University of Maine in a department that does things that are very close to my heart and close to ESF. And I ended up moving to a place called Argyle Township, almost in the center of Maine. It's unincorporated, no town government. About 200 residents. There's about 5 PhDs, and that seems awful high. I'm not sure if it's a record. It's rural, low taxes, few services, and there turns out to be a like-minded community of people who call themselves riverbillies as opposed to hillbillies. And it's very close to UMaine, within commuting distance, and probably within biking distance, if I could bike. So I'm going to talk about the energetics of a model homestead, and I'm going to use mine here. Call it Peeper Hollow. It turns out to be the most densely populated with mosquitoes in the state of Maine, at least for recorded densities. There might be other places. So it's 27 acres. It's mostly woodlot. There's give or take, a third of it is wetland, beaver meadow, and backwaters from the Penobscot River. Borders the Penobscot River. There's a small section we have devoted to agriculture and a bit of rental property for some monetary income. So some of the activities that we haven't quantified yet but are pretty important, and I think they're profitable, but I would like to quantify, is raising chickens. We can produce a surplus of about 6 or 8 dozen eggs a week, and about 50 to 75 meat birds for sale or barter. Tried experimenting with other livestock. Ducks were a complete failure. Turkeys were giving a second try. We grow a lot of fruits and vegetables and grow a lot of soil, or at least help the microbes grow soil. My wife is an accomplished beekeeper and the Maine State apiarist. So she helps her bees produce a lot of honey. So we have value-added commodities like jams, jellies, and honeys. Originally, I wanted to try keeping bees as well, but I don't like getting stung and I don't like wearing the bee suit. So I'm out of that. I try to hunt quite a bit. I enjoy waterfowl and upland bird hunting when I had 2 very good bird dogs. I'll admit that those deer are not from Maine, but I can't resist any opportunity to show a picture of them. We have opportunities for foraging for especially fiddleheads, ostrich fern shoots, and chicken of the woods and things like that. We do some small-scale timber harvest and do some on-site milling of lumber and use some of that to build some structures. We have a 1.8 kilowatt PV system tied to the grid that hopefully one day will expand and be standalone. But I've been thinking about how is this worth it? So I wanted to do a biophysical analysis of this homesteading. Is it a wise investment? Is it profitable? Or is it simply a waste of time and maybe a feel-good activity that's actually a lot of work? So I'm going to present data for 3 activities which are pretty important I have good data on. So fuel for home heating is firewood. A lot of our food is protein from ice fishing. And an important value-added commodity for either our luxury consumption or for bartering or trading or just giving away is maple syrup. And so I'm going to be looking at the natural production, the human labor, and also purchased inputs, manufactured goods and fuel and stuff like that from the main economy to yield a certain output. And so we've been building energy flow models to eventually get to energy return on investment and also emergy analysis, which I'll explain in just a minute, and to figure out how much fossil fuel subsidies are required to make the homestead run. So I'll start with the first model, harvesting firewood for home heating. So very simple systems, you know, Odom style diagram. Sun and wind and rain would be the energy inputs to emergy models, but we'll just talk now for sunlight fueling the forest, and then the family working a job, being able to purchase goods and services, and to apply them, and also the labor, and harvest the firewood. So the procedure is, and showing you the human labor involved here, so in the woodlot, felling trees with a chainsaw, bucking them up, hauling them to a staging area.
That's a steel, isn't it?
It is, yep, an MS-362. Originally, I had these grand plans of training the dogs to pull the firewood. I thought that would save me some time and effort, and the dogs are far too smart for that. So I ended up doing it myself. And just to give you an idea of how we haul firewood, a harness to the sled.
The dog is leading the way.
Oh, sorry. So just to give you an idea of the extent, a round trip to the woodlot and back is about 1 kilometer. It can carry about 0.03 cords per sled load. So it takes 163 round trips and about 82 kilometers of total hauling distance, which is more than 50% of my time and energy budget. And this is essentially impossible without snow and ice.
You don't have a track through the property?
I have some harvesting potential on the property, and we're looking into actually getting some more land, but the vast majority of the woodlot is across a wetland and inaccessible, aside if there's no snow ice. Sorry, what was that?
By law?
No, but physically impossible to get to. It's wetland.
Unless you have snow and ice.
Unless I have snow and ice. I mean, I guess I could put the bolts in a canoe if I have enough water, but usually the level of the water is too shallow for canoeing and too deep for wading, so it's very inconvenient. Yeah. So splitting and stacking, preferable in the winter. It's a lot easier, a lot less labor when the wood's green and frozen, and of course it's got to be done in the winter so it can air dry over the summer. So here's the harvest. The annual harvest, give or take, and our annual consumption is about 5 cords. On the left-hand side is about 4 cords, on the right-hand side is about 2, so that quantity is a little bit over.
4 foot deep or 16 inches?
These are 8, roughly measured 8 by 8 by 4.
Okay.
Yep. So if you're not familiar, the stack cord is 128 square cubic foot, but if you account for the air spaces, the net cord is actually lower than that. So I've accounted for that. It's predominantly red maple, about 50%, but we've got about equal proportions red oak, black cherry, gray birch, and then a few other miscellaneous trees. It comes out to about 1,500 kilograms a cord, energy density about 21 millijoules a kilogram. So the total heat equivalence of that 5 cords, not just recoverable heat, but also including through inefficient loss through the smokestack, is about 157,000 megajoules. So that's the harvest output. So the human labor inputs, the harvesting essentially has to occur over the winter for about 3 months. So it's mostly human, amplified by fossil fuel power chainsaw and some simple hand tools, splitting maul and whatnot. So I took my activity and time budget for harvesting, 5 cords of wood. It's about 145 hours of what I consider moderate activity. It's equivalent to using these references, a vigorous hiking at 4 miles per hour. So I assumed a total metabolic rate of 400 watts. I subtracted the resting basal metabolism because that would be energy spent no matter what I was doing. So devoting 320 watts of active metabolism to harvesting wood. So essentially, this is what we've just been talking about. essentially two ways to quantify physical labor. You can look at it as me just simply being a beast of burden, a metabolic machine. You put food in, you generate power, and you dump waste out, waste heat and waste out. Or Mr. Moneybags. I'm a societal elite that commands huge flows of mostly fossil energy by earning and spending dollars from a job that's tied to the industrial economy, providing sufficient economic surplus and leisure time to subsidize homesteading. So to pay for healthcare and mortgage and groceries and retirement account and dog food and all that stuff. So if we just look at the active metabolism, just take 145 hours times 320 watts active metabolism, 167 megajoules. So that doesn't account for any of the direct and indirect energy from the economy that subsidizes this entire lifestyle. So I thought about multiplying that by the average number of energy slaves, and Charlie had different suggestions, so I thank him for those. So one way to do it would take the fossil fuel equivalents of food energy and the cost of transporting that food to get there. So you multiply that by 10.3 and you get 1,700 megajoules. And then another way to do it is to take my annual salary from my real job, and I prorate it for how much labor that salary is supporting, multiply that by how many megajoules are embodied per dollar of economic activity, and that comes out to over 6,000 megajoules. So you can see the huge difference in either accounting for or failing to account for that indirect and direct energy. So purchased inputs from the main economy, figure out how much gasoline we need from the chainsaw, almost 1,000 megajoules, figure out how much manufactured equipment we would need, amortize the cost over whatever the lifetime happens to be. It turns out to be about $200 a year, give or take. And then we take that dollar value, the 5.5 megajoules embodied, again, at Charlie's suggestion, multiply that by 2 for heavy manufacturing, and we come out with 2,200 megajoules for input. So for a total, about 3,000 megajoules of stuff purchased from the economy. So when we compute the energy return on investment, we take the energy contained in the firewood divided by the energy spent on labor and purchased goods, understanding very well that those are all very different forms of energy. So I'm always skeptical about the numerator and denominator being different forms. So we take the firewood divided by the purchases plus the labor, and if we only count just the heat equivalents of the actual physical work, the energy return on investment is very high, 49 to 1. And if we go down, especially to the most conservative, the energy return on investment is still moderately high, 17 to 1. Certainly high enough to be worthwhile and profitable. The next step would be figure out how much natural production is required to support the firewood harvest. So if we go to the USDA Forest Service 2016 main inventory data for a lowland red maple red oak forest, 95,000 kilograms per hectare, air dry, so we'll have to convert that to oven dry, biomass of live trees. We multiply the biomass by the energy density, so we get about 2 million megajoules per hectare of forest. So how much of that forest area is required to produce 5 cords? About 0.08 hectares, or about 0.8% of the homestead area. So essentially, firewood harvesting could be sustainable in the sense we would never deplete the forest. It's only a very tiny fraction of the forest that we're taking out. So how much how much solar energy would that require? Well, if we take, again, from that inventory, the above ground net primary production comes out to be 190,000 megajoules per hectare per year. So that hectare's worth is 14,000 or so megajoules per year. How much solar energy is required? And there's essentially 2 ways, well, more than that, but we're 2 ways to estimate it here. Jerry's preference, and he's obviously the expert at this, is to use a peanut model. And so Jerry is working on this, maybe not as we speak, but he's working on this. But just to get a placeholder estimate, and I know Jerry's not real happy with this, and I know Charlie's not happy with this, if we just take the above ground net primary production divided by a 1% photosynthetic conversion efficiency, comes out to be about 1.5 million megajoules of sunlight required to support that 5 cords of firewood. And then I wanted to extend this to energy analysis, and I won't give you the details, but essentially we followed the procedures that were first developed by Howard Odom and then developed further by especially Mark Brown and Dan Campbell and Sergio Ugliotti. And just a refresher, if you're not familiar with it, originally it was a contraction for energy memory or embodied energy, defined as the available energy of one kind that's previously transformed, used up directly and indirectly to make something a product or a service of a different kind. Odom would say, and I think I probably agree with him, that it's an objective scientific measure of real wealth and value. And so it allows you to compare the work of nature and humans on a common basis. It allows you to evaluate alternative policies based upon maximizing real wealth and productivity. And it does account for these different forms of energy doing different types of work. And this arises from Odom's, I don't know if it's his self-described fifth law of thermodynamics, but that of energy hierarchy. And it's expressed as solar M-joules. And then we also think about transformity, which is the energy of one kind of energy required to generate a product or service of another kind. And to get this, you take the energy that's flowing times the transformity. You would express this as solar M-joules per joule. And then you could also express an M dollars. That is the amount of energy that's required to support $1 of economic activity that's sort of aggregated or integrated over the entire economy. So you take money circulation, divide by energy flow. And for this, I'm borrowing very heavily from a postdoc at the University of Maine, Betsy Barber, who's been working very closely with Mark Brown and very peripherally with me, because these guys are the experts on this, not me, to do an energy analysis of Maine's brook trout fisheries. So I want to acknowledge their hard work for getting some of our data here. The numbers aren't really important here other than we're taking environmental inputs plus skilled human labor plus fuels plus purchased goods to get an output of firewood. What's really interesting are the indices that we come up with. So the transformity of firewood is about 3 million solar M-joules per joule, which is comparable roughly with an order of magnitude for agricultural industrial products, industrial ag products. If we take the yield, the output divided by the economic inputs, the economy and the subsidized human labor, is about a 1.2 ratio. If we take the yield divided by natural inputs, it's about a 6.5 ratio. And if we take the natural divided by the economic inputs, it's about 0.2. So this tells you how much of the various components are contributing proportionally to the overall yield. What if we imagine selling this firewood back to the economy for the market price, let's say $300 per cord, which would also have the stacking fee included? So Odom developed what he called an exchange ratio, or a buyer's benefit. So by exchanging dollars, which have embodied energy, for a good or a service that has embodied energy, how much does the buyer benefit from making that transaction, giving money for that? And so if you take the energy in those dollars divided by the energy of firewood, that's a 6.2. And if you flipped it around and said, what would be the woodcutter's benefit of doing all the work, well, not a little of the work and harvesting nature's work, and selling it for money and then using that money to buy stuff from the economy, that benefits 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, of 0.16.
Not bad.
Don't quit my day job.
Yeah, right.
Yes, the higher the ratio, the better it is for the buyer and the worse for the producer and seller. So anyway, if we account for the energy indirectly and directly supporting me, my lavish lifestyle to subsidize this, it's still profitable for homesteading, but it's not useful for generating economic surplus and selling elsewhere. All right, Model 2, harvesting high protein food for ice fishing. We're going to look at two scenarios: cold water, warm water fisheries. Cold water is mostly salmonids and also burbot, which are freshwater cod and rainbow smelt. These are in deep, cold, oligotrophic lakes, mostly native, some stock. They're generally more remote, harder to get to, very high angler demand, and mostly strict regulations except no limit on burbot, which is going to be important. And you can see just from brook trout, mostly up to the north and the west. So again, we built this energy flow diagram. A simple lake food web over on the left, the same sort of structure on the right. A warm water fishery, which I'll just call panfish, mostly sunfishes and perches. Shallow, warm, meso or eutrophic lakes. They're mostly invasive. They're mostly in southern and coastal Maine. They're generally much more accessible, but much lower angler demand, except for a very few of us, and essentially there's no regulations. And so the crappie distribution, for example, is mostly southern coastal, but they're spreading. Again, we have the same sort of thing. We have this warm water, a very coarse food web diagram here, linked to the economic activity. So I have, I'm going to show partial or complete harvest data from lakes fished over 3 seasons. The blues show cold water, the yellows show warm water. It shows you the proximity to Argyle. And of course, most of the really good cold water lakes are off the map. Give you an idea of frequency distribution of fish harvested per trip. Most cold water trips are absolute failures, no fish, and a pretty good mix of outcomes for warm water. Typical harvest for cold water is nothing, and a very successful harvest is a nice bourbon or two. For warm water, that's a pretty good harvest for an early season or for a short day. That's a pretty good harvest, maybe not exceptional for my favorite place, Herman Pond. There's more gratuitous fish pictures. So again, frequency distributions of fish biomass harvested in kilograms, so living fish removed from the systems. And then what's left over, the edible fillet biomass removed from the system. So anywhere up, from 0 to all the way up to almost 3 kilograms of fish meat that's edible. So we have here, I'm going to do warm water and cold water, mostly black crappie, mostly bourbon. So we have total harvest of 65 kilograms versus 6 kilograms. There's more meat on these warm water fish than cold water. We take the energy density of the raw fillet, a little bit more fat in the cold water fish. So we ended up getting 97 megajoules back from the warm water, 6 megajoules back from the cold water. There's our average fillet yield per trip, and to meet an adult male's protein requirements, it would take 21 ice fishing trips, double that for my wife, and then it would take, a year's worth of ice fishing for her. So the human had metabolic work. It's all non-mechanized. It's a hand auger. It's pulling a sled. It's mostly active metabolism. I suppose sitting there and jigging isn't too active, but you are withstanding the cold. So here's our work summary. Recorded ice time, 85 hours versus 104. But eventually, if we get down and we look at the metabolic work required using the most conservative estimate, 3 to 5,000 megajoules. Purchased inputs, the same procedure as we described before. We can see average travel distance, actually cold water or closer. Average bait cost, I thought the bait expense of buying a dozen rainbow smelt each time for cold water fishery would be really important. Turns out they're not. So about the same total purchased inputs. And if we take our fillet yields as our output, and we add up all together the inputs, so you can see it's simply not worth fishing. So, well, how much natural production is required for that harvest? Ideally, we would use otoliths that you've seen there to reconstruct growth histories of fish, and also couple those to bioenergetics models, temperature dependent and allometric, to figure out fish growth and productivity. So I have about 2,000 panfish otoliths over 10 years of harvest. So that will get done at some point. And once we get those data, this is where Jerry's going to jump in, and he's got he and Charlie have an excellent model for Little Sandy Creek that hopefully he can tweak to make applicable to a lake system. But just for now, some back-of-the-envelope calculations. We use published production to biomass ratios. Those are a function of mortality and weight and maturity and the trophic status of the fish. And then we use those and we back project it through the food web with really rough generalizations of trophic transfer efficiencies, 10% for detrivores and herbivores, up to 25% for piscivores. And our very rough calculation is it takes about 33 million megajoules of sunlight per year to give us a harvest of 49 megajoules of panfish fillets, and about 6 million megajoules per year to get our 7.3 megajoules of bourbon fillets. So warm water fishing could meet protein demand, but it's a net energy loser. Invasive species are spreading northward and eastward with climate change and introduction, so maybe there will be more fisheries closer to me, and maybe they'll actually be more productive. Cold water fishing is not profitable under any scenario, and probably won't be around in its present state for very much longer, shrinking range of these species, and maybe eventual extirpation. And so really what I'm weighing is the psychological satisfaction and mental well-being I get from being out in the ice fishing versus the constraints I'm facing from climate change and economic shocks that would prevent me from traveling long distances to fish. Energy analysis, we're gonna forget about that. I'll go quickly through the maple syrup. So looking at maple syrup production for a luxury consumption and bartering, I've been collecting data over 4 seasons. I only have really good data for last season, but you'll see over the course of a season, first of all, it's highly variable. It's also variable from year to year, but a lot of this has to do with me refining my technique and adding more trees.
What happened to your honey? I thought that was the...
I have no data on
Okay.
the honey. And I think I was talking to John about this, about figuring out how to link the metabolic rate of bees to the work of the beekeeper and all that. That's actually something I really like to do. But anyway, 2018 was a fantastic year. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So again, a very coarse model here of maple syrup production. And the red maples are producing the sap, and most of the firewood is conifers, but I'm actually going to combine them. I've combined a lot of steps into one here just for simplicity, but eventually getting an output that we can either consume or barter with friends, probably not enemies. So the steps of this would be tapping, collecting, and hauling. Really the only mechanization here is just a rechargeable power drill. So all of it's done with buckets and sleds, and again, dog power is not an option. So boiling here is done, it took me several years to get a good technique down here, but it's done over a very simple concrete stove outside. Probably add a 4th pan next year to increase the surface area. This is about as effective and or efficient that I can get without some major investment. And then there's the finishing off, doing that last bit of boiling inside an electric stove, and then the canning process. So I don't have a whole lot of data here. So maple sap will range from anywhere to 0.5% to 5%, give or take, and Alan, feel free to correct any of this if it's wrong. Sugar content, maple syrup is right around 66% sugar content. Any more than that, it turns to candy. So the syrup yield will be a function of the sap flow, which I have no control over, the sugar content, which is variable and have no control over, and then the number of taps, which I have some control over. The major drivers of this would be tree age and condition, which I really have no control over, climate duration, previous fall's mass. It turns out that's actually a huge driver of how much sugar there is. For this year, we had a huge flow, but also the previous year was a huge masting event. So there was very low sugar content in the sap because the tree devoted much of its energy resources to seeds. So for on the homestead, we're using almost entirely red maple. So for 2018, 36 taps yielded 453 gallons of sap, which boiled down to 11 gallons of syrup. And sorry, these aren't metric. I can only think of maple syrup in terms of gallons or tablespoons. So the average would be 44 gallons of sap yielding 1 gallon of syrup, which again is very low, most likely a function of the low sugar content because of a heavy mast year. So the human labor inputs, harvesting anywhere over a 2 to 8 week period, setting taps and hauling buckets, I assumed was moderate physical activity. A lot of this is sitting around and watching sap boil and maybe doing some other stuff. So I just said that was a somewhat sedentary metabolic rate of about 200 watts. And here's just a time scale here of the 2018 hours spent, which are the blue, and then the energy spent, the most conservative estimate, in the orange. Tapping, there's a little bit of energy at the outset, and then there's a big expenditure when there's a boiling, and often that'll take over 24 hours of sitting around and staying up late and whatnot. So here we have 6 pulses of sap production. It was a very long, very productive season, surprisingly. And so fuel consumption, the vast majority is boiled outside with firewood. A very small part is inside, starting on the wood stove, and then finally on the electric stove, and also the canning's done on the electric stove. So for now, I'm going to ignore the electricity. I really don't know how much I'm using, but half of it, give or take, comes from the homestead photovoltaic, so I think it's safe to ignore it. 2 cords of firewood this year yielded about 11 gallons of cert. Probably less expensive to harvest dead and down conifer. It's closer, doesn't require as much transportation versus the standing hardwood, but I'm going to assume it's the same as my home heating firewood. So about 63,000 megajoules. Figure out how much money we spent. Again, translate that to megajoules. So about 232 hours at that very high energy intensity of a highly subsidized person working was about 10,000 megajoules. And thanks so much to Alan for getting on the internet in the last 10 minutes before the talk and figuring out, getting some information on sugar content. So out of that 11 gallons, we get about 634 megajoules of sugar. So if we were just to eat that sugar to fuel our bodies, the energy return on investment is about it's actually 1 to 1,000. So you invest a joule, and you invest 1,000 and you get 1 joule back in sugar. But if you were now to take the embodied energy equivalent of dollars and you were to sell that for the market price of $60 a gallon, that's actually a 300 to 1 ratio. So very, very profitable.
300 or 30?
30, it's a typo. It's actually 300 to 1 if you account for the energy cost of the dollar versus the energy cost of the syrup. So if one could theoretically make a pretty decent profit, an energy profit, maybe not a monetary profit, by maple sugaring. So I don't really know what the future holds other than a lot of disruptions as far as peak oil and a collapsing economy. But short term, I'm most concerned about climate change because essentially all of these activities require snow and ice and at least a semi-predictable winter transition into spring. That's what it looks like trying to get to my sugar bush at the end of a relatively short season. So essentially, with climate change, I'm expecting a lot of stranded assets across the wetland that I simply can't get to during the winter. And I'm out of time, so I'm just going to stop it right there, and you can tell me whether or not you think I'm wasting my time. Any questions? Ken?
Yes. Have you costed out the potential costs of a raised plank roadway?